Order, order. Welcome to this first session in our post-pandemic economic growth inquiry. We all recognise the enormity of the economic challenge facing our country and indeed the world, with the most significant post-war recessionary environment and warnings from the OECD that the United Kingdom has one of the most distinct challenges of developed nations in its recovery. And we know this isn't just about GDP figures. This is about employment, it's about skills, about equality, it's about climate change, and about the success and strength of the British economy for the future. And that's why this super inquiry will be taking evidence over the coming months on how we can build back better for Britain. And this first session will look at the economic environment before the pandemic and discuss what the impact of the pandemic has been on it, so that we can understand the baseline on which we wish to build in the coming weeks and months ahead. And I'm delighted to have two fantastic witnesses on our panel this morning. Professor Mariana Mazzucato, who's the director of UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose and a professor of economics of innovation and public purpose, and Professor Diane Coyle, who's the Bennett Professor of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge. Welcome to you both. I'm just going to start with a general question to get us going, and I'll be delighted to hear answers from both of you. And my first question is, what would you describe as being the key features which defined the state of the UK economy before the pandemic? And maybe, Diane, you're first on my screen, so I'll come to you first.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for the invitation to give evidence today in this very important inquiry. I think it's been a story of strengths and weaknesses with the UK economy. Clearly, we've got some very innovative areas such as fintech and AI. We've got a thriving creative sector, higher education.
We have an internet challenge with Diane, so I'm going to move swiftly on to Mariana and hope we can come back to Diane in a second. So over to you, Mariana.
Okay. Oh dear. Well, I thank you as well. This is a real honor and I think a very urgent inquiry. So without being too negative, I'll focus actually on the challenges. I think there are, as Diana was saying, lots of positive, and I've actually been working over the last 2 years with the government around some of that positivity, specifically around a challenge-led industrial strategy, which I know we'll get to later. But just on the challenges, I think the first has been the direction of growth, not so much the rate. And that's been a rate of growth that really has been led by the consumption part of GDP, and that consumption has been fueled in fact, by private debt, so that the ratio of private debt to disposable income is actually back at the record levels it was before the financial crisis. The bad news there is that's what actually caused the financial crisis. Second is that the form of finance we have in the UK has been kind of overly financialized. And by that, I mean that too much of it just goes back to the financial sector. Some Bank of England data shows that something like only about 20 to 25% of finance actually even just reaches the real economy itself. A lot of it goes back to finance, insurance, and real estate. The acronym there is FIRE. The other thing is a short-termist corporate governance structure, of course, not across the board. And it's always important to remember that there is, amongst any of these statistics and numbers, heterogeneity within the category. But in general, the kind of Anglo-Saxon model of corporate governance has, in fact, been quite short-termist in the sense that this pressure to maximize shareholder value has led to lower kind of rates of investments in those areas that actually produce long-term growth. I'm thinking of things like research and development, which continues to be lower than the OECD average. The other thing is something I think that really is very dear to me. And the reason I set up the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose is really that the public sector itself has increasingly been losing in some ways its capacity to govern. Obviously, not again across the board, but this over-reliance on outsourcing to the private sector of some key government functions has, it potentially hurts the kind of trial and error learning by doing within government and the lack of investment within government's own capabilities because of this over-reliance. And on top of that, over the last kind of decade, the austerity years, if you want, we can call it that, has characterized, key areas like public health have been losing funds. So since 2015, there's been 850 million pounds lower in real terms to public health itself. So then the crisis comes and we need to throw money at the public health service. But if in the meantime it's been hurt in terms of its own, again, capacity, then that's a problem. Just coming back to the issue I was mentioning before, though, in terms of the private sector, what's interesting is it itself kind of loses capacity. So this overly financialized business model means that its investment in its own productive capacity can be falling over time. And in fact, you do see that in terms of aggregate investment levels. Again, if you look at the investment side of GDP in the UK, has on trend been falling over the last decade.
Thank you for that. And productivity has been a kind of underlying theme to many of the points that you've mentioned there.
Yes, sorry. Productivity is in fact then a result, if you want, a result of that lack of investment. Where does productivity actually come from? From areas like investing in human capital, in investing in research and development. So if these long-run investments are not made due to an overly financialized and short-termist corporate culture, then productivity, of course, will suffer from that. It's also true that productivity, of course, comes from particular types of institutions. And so, for example, science-industry linkages are extremely important to the economy's productive capacity. And the catapult centers, which were set up over the last years, are a huge improvement, but we continue to underinvest in that. The last time I checked, we invest only about a tenth of what Germany actually invests in areas like their Fraunhofer Institutes. I'm not sure if the data has changed since I last checked, but again, we haven't necessarily been making those kinds of investments over the last kind of 20 or 30 years. So we're catching up in terms of really creating a dynamic innovation system. The science base is quite strong, but those science industry linkages have been weaker than in some of our northern neighbors.
There's your submission there, Mariana, that we've understood some of the challenges around productivity, but perhaps we've not been funding it adequately in order to challenge. Is that the point you were just making?
Yes, exactly. And again, I mean, the culture, of kind of the dividends and share buyback mode of focusing on a quarterly return. So, that is not unrelated to then the lack of investments that are made in that kind of productive capacity. So I think a recent report I saw by Commonwealth, a think tank, found that the 100 largest non-financial UK firms, so the ones, again, in the real economy, paid out 400 billion in dividends and 61 billion in share buybacks between 2011, 2018, and that's equivalent to 68% of their total net profit. So that's, again, a large amount of finance going outside of productive capacity. So it's both a question of reinvesting profits back into those areas, but also setting up structures, which I would put under the heading of a strong national system of innovation, which, again, there's lots of actual positive stories there. I'm sure we'll get to it later. This more recent challenge-led industrial strategy that we've had, and also the attention to particular institutions like the ARPA model. This has been a very recent development in the UK innovation discourse. Those are all really positive movements towards thinking about not just productivity as an aggregate kind of data point, but actually what do we know about the long-run drivers of productivity in different countries, and how can we start building that productive capacity both within the private sector, again, thinking about a more long-term corporate governance model, within the public sector in terms of the investments it itself has to make in areas like publicly funded R&D, but also the relationships between public and private in terms of the fundamental linkages that we need between science and industry.
Understood, thank you. And you'll be pleased to know that Diane is back with us, I think. So I'll go back to Diane with that opening question about the defining features of the state of the UK economy pre-pandemic. Welcome back, Diane. Oh, you'll need to unmute yourself, I think. There we go. Yeah.
Our internet chose to crash at that moment. I do apologise.
No problem.
I think what else I was planning to say actually is entirely consistent with what I heard from Mariana just then, which is about the persistently low level of investment in the UK economy. We've lagged the OECD average, been near the bottom of the league table for many years now, and it's across the board. It's been private business investment, it's been investment in R&D, in infrastructure, investment in certain kinds of skills. It's been both public and private. And investment is key because it does not only indicate confidence in the future, it actually determines the sustainable rate of growth over long periods of time. And if we don't address that, we're going to be baking in relative decline to the British economy for years and decades to come. And even before the pandemic, the trend in the UK had been quite adverse. The economy was generally quite weak, and the Brexit uncertainty for 3 years before the pandemic hit us had itself added to the discouragement of business investment. So we've got actually a big backlog to make up in all of these domains of investment.
On now to the question of the industrial strategy.
Can I just add one thing? Sorry, because I think I'm sure we both agree on this, but we should at least put it on the record that another huge problem is inequality. So average real wages in the UK still remain below their 2008 peak, but also that's, again, affected also by structural conditions, including the relative weakness, for example, of trade unions, so worker bargaining power. And the number of people in work poverty was, in fact, at an all-time high, according to the Rowntree Foundation, even just before the crisis. So 56% of people are living in poverty were in a household where at least one person had a job in 2018.
Thank you for that. And we will come on to some of those issues, including geographical inequalities as well, which of course we know is a priority for the government. Moving on to the industrial strategy, and I'll come to you first, Marina, because I know you've been involved in this. What are your reflections on the current iteration of the UK's industrial strategy? Has it really delivered the outcomes that was hoped when it was put together?
So, in some ways, it's too early to tell. The real question is whether the Boris Johnson administration will continue the effort as Theresa May's government did. And so the big change in that industrial strategy under Theresa May, so with Greg Clark when he was Minister of Bays, was that it moved away from thinking of the vertical part of industrial strategy as just picking sectors. You'll remember that there was a list of sectors under Vince Cable, and he was the Bays minister. They were, I think, automotive, aerospace, life sciences, creative industries, and finance, financial services. And that kind of takes a view of industrial strategy as types of sectors to support. And then, of course, there is a horizontal part of that, which has to do with skills, capabilities, and kind of the science base. But the real change in Theresa May's government's industrial strategy, and part of it was also engagement, again, with our institute, which was cited in that 2017 industrial strategy, was to take a challenge-oriented lens rather than a sectoral lens. So instead of making a list of top sectors, they chose 4 challenges, which were around clean growth, the future of mobility, healthy aging, and the opportunities that are presented by AI and big data. And the idea there is that you use those challenges to really foster both investment, obviously, in the industrial capacity of those of all kind of UK sectors, but especially think how they can together collaborate, invest, and innovate in order to solve what we then call missions underneath those challenges, right? So a carbon neutral city or region will require investments not just in renewable energy, but in all sorts of materials, as well as how we eat, how we walk, how we move. Financial services themselves need to modernize for that. Digital design, AI, digital will all be part of a strategy that is around clean growth. And so that kind of cross-sectoral lens of the strategy versus that sectoral approach, I think, was very important. Now, since the recent administration came into power, I think there was so much attention then to Brexit that at least lots of the people that we were working with through my institute in Bays actually were moved over to the Brexit team. So I think now that Brexit has been done, the real question is, will we again see a real emphasis on a challenge-oriented approach? Because there's no point in talking about sort of an ARPA model if we don't have big challenges for ARPA to address. In fact, if I can just pause there a minute, the DARPA model and the ARPA model in the United States, which has really been the one that has inspired I think Downing Street, in particular, Dominic Cummings, is a very important one to learn from. But there's 2 parts of it that we really need to pay attention to. One is, again, what I was just talking about, that DARPA in the past had success in the US because it was focused on big problems that need to be solved. So the internet was a spillover of the fact that they wanted the satellites to communicate, or GPS was a spillover and a solution to the problem of knowing how to basically bomb very carefully for the army. And Siri, touchscreen display, all the things basically in our iPhones, you could almost see them as solutions to big problems that organizations like DARPA then try to tackle, always in conjunction, in collaboration, by the way, with the private sector. But the other point is that it was also done through procurement, procurement itself. So government as purchaser, not just government as investor, created a real funnel through which, for example, startups that were financed through programs like the Small Business Innovation Research Program, there's a similar one here in the UK, SBRI, that created a real scaling up process. So instead of focusing on startups or SMEs as somehow inherently innovative or important, the real focus there has always been on scaling up those companies, small, medium, or large, that are willing to engage with government on these kind of big missions, which in the past tended to be more wartime, but in the more recent present has been just as active in areas like energy, so ARPA-E, but also in the health budget. So the National Institutes of Health in the US spend $40 billion a year on health innovation. And so I think the really interesting thing, again, with Greg Clark is he really took on board that challenge-oriented, mission-oriented lens of the strategy. Again, I'm talking more about the vertical element of that. The horizontal remains incredibly important on skills, and I know Diane Coyle works with the Industrial Strategy Council on those areas. But I haven't seen yet the current administration putting as much attention to that challenge-oriented 2017 industrial strategy. And I really hope that now is the moment to do that, both because the attention now can hopefully move away from the obsession around Brexit, but also the COVID crisis itself is throwing to us many challenges, both those that are related to health, but also, of course, a digital divide. So I've got 4 children. They might be educated quite well at home because we have, as you can see here, quite good broadband. Not everyone has that. Not everyone has laptops, iPads, iPhones at home or smartphones. And here I think there's real inspiration to be had from the BBC back in the 1980s when there was that mission, again, if I can continue to use that word, challenged for an adult literacy program and also getting all kids to learn how to code in schools. And it was actually the procurement of that mission that led to the ability of both ARM and Acorn, two very important UK tech companies, to scale up. So you had both a mission, it was societal, social, around the kind of digital challenges that we also talk about today. It produced the BBC microcomputer, and to produce that, it required a procurement strategy that led to that scaling up. And so I think it's more that holistic view of industrial strategy that we really need to be continuing to push forwards. And I urge the government to, really build on the work that Greg Clark's team.
Thank you for that. And Diane, coming to you on the industrial strategy, what evidence or early signs have you seen about actual delivery through the industrial strategy? Have we seen that cross-sectoral collaboration that's resulted in economic growth, or are there kind of lessons to be learned from the early few years of it being in place?
I think it really is too early to be sure, because having a strategy is the important part. If you want to fix long-term weaknesses, that's going to be difficult and it's going to take time, and you might not expect to get any evidence or results within a couple of years. But it's really important for government to take that lead in aligning the expectations and activities of individuals and businesses over long-term horizons. So my concern about it would be that it gets ditched early, and then in another couple of years we have another so-called strategy, because this is the third in the 2000s already. And we have a very distinctive pattern of policy seesaws in the UK. A couple of years ago, the Institute for Government documented 29 major skills policy reforms since the 1980s. So that's about one a year. We've had half a dozen energy market reorganisations in the same span, and this is an industry where investment horizons can be up to 50 years. So government does intervene all the time. We've had an industrial policy in favour of the finance sector, which includes infrastructure investment like the Jubilee Line and London City Airports, included the regulatory environment. And I think the key is to do it purposefully and consistently, strategically over time. So to echo somewhat what Marianne is saying, I don't think of it in terms of challenges, but in terms of what horizontal policies is it important for government to put into place and to keep consistent. So one is publicly financed R&D spending, and we've got the commitment from government on that, which is very encouraging. That crowds in private research spending. They go together, they're not opposites. Stable skills policy environment and adequate funding of skills policy. Public procurement, using public procurement intelligently, not always looking for the lowest cost possibility, but thinking about using that for innovative purposes. Technical standards, things like digital switchover for television, setting a date and making sure that the standards are aligned. And importantly, and I think this has been underemphasized in the industrial strategy, a really tough competition policy. And I think there's quite good evidence from the OECD and others that some markets are becoming less competitive over time. And the environment of the post-pandemic recession is actually going to make it harder, but more important to have a very effective competition policy.
I'm going to now bring in colleagues from the committee, and I'm first going to go to Richard Fuller. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Chair. It's a pleasure to welcome the witnesses. in the interest of time, I think, if I may, I can direct my questions to Professor Coyle. Professor, we were talking a little earlier on about problems in the economy, and of course, picking faults and identifying problems is the easy part. Certainly, if we look into the private sector, perhaps easy to pick on some faults. You talked a bit. I'd like to ask what the risks are of the government having an industrial strategy, and you talked, I think, about the difficulties in government maintaining a strategy. You said 29 skills policy reforms, half a dozen energy market changes. Is that the main risk of a government having an industrial strategy? What other risks should we be looking out for?
Well, we know from the old style industrial policies that the other risk is that the policy becomes a vehicle for supporting companies that are not viable in the long term for very understandable reasons. And there may be circumstances where you want to smooth the transition in terms of job losses, or where there may be place-based reasons. You don't want the impact of a closure to fall too heavily in one place. And those are valid reasons for sort of transitional support. But everybody knows that the picking winners hazard of old-style industrial policies. But I don't think anybody, certainly in the economics community, is talking about that now. The focus is very much on horizontal policies and Mariana's emphasis on challenges and what long-term problems do we know that we're going to face as a society, be it decarbonisation or aging populations.
Policymakers may not be talking about place, but I can assure you the politicians are. The steel industry, for example, is very much driven by local MPs with local employees at risk, and place continues to be a risk. So I can see the aspect of it being risk, but I'm also interested, Professor Coyle, in your thoughts on place as a positive. Historically, people felt a sense of pride. They were from Sheffield, and Sheffield was a steel town. They were from Stoke, and Stoke was a potteries town. And over the last 30, 40 years, we've seen the benefits of globalization, but perhaps less emphasis on place, and then less connectivity and sense of belonging. What are your thoughts about the role of industrial strategy in that particular one of the 5 foundations that our colleague Mr. Clark put together?
I think this focus on place is clearly essential. We know that not only have median incomes not gone up for 10 years or so, that has fallen unequally in terms of geography as well as in terms of categories of people. And the challenge is that the fundamental economic drivers, the technological changes, the shift towards service-based and intangibles-based economy have actually emphasized, accelerated those forces of divergence between places, favoring big cities and leaving behind, as the phrase goes, some other places. So I think it's just essential as a society to start to address that. And one of the things that industrial policy or industrial strategy can start to do is to get a much more granular understanding of what it is that certain places both need and can move into. And we've been generalizing too much, I think, about these possibilities. So local industrial strategies therefore become a very important part of the armory, because then you get the information that can only be known at local level and not in SW1 about what employers' needs are, for instance. And so you might start to think about devolving skills policies, because it isn't just that employers might need electricians, they might need a certain kind of electrician given what's possible and what growth is feasible in a certain area. And so I think it's an important vehicle for addressing those place-based challenges, but it's a tough challenge. We've had.
Do you think just on the issue of the granulated data? I know that's an area of your concern. Yeah. Do you think with the greater availability of data now, that will help rebalance from when we think about place, focusing on sort of defending what we have, protecting what we have, rather than understanding what we can be on a local level and trying to draw together? Is that where the local data improvements will help?
I think you've touched on a really important issue. We don't have as much data as we need. The availability of local data has improved enormously, and the Office for National Statistics in the past few years has done a tremendous job in increasing that availability. But there's still a lot of data that it's not possible to access, and both officials in BEIS and the Treasury, but also the research community would love to be able to address that. So I would like to add to this economic strategy a national data infrastructure strategy, where we can start to join together and create the right metadata for official figures, for administrative data, for health data, for all the many surveys available, and also for some of the data that's held by private sector companies that we can't access at the moment.
Can I, Chair, one final question? Sorry, Dr. Professor Cole.
No, please go ahead.
I'm just conscious of time, and if I may, Chair, one final question to build on the issue of data that Professor Cole mentioned, and my apologies to the other witness, just to focus my questions here. AI and the data economy is one of the 4 grand challenges. You talked about competition policy. Isn't it true that there is really no data champion in the United Kingdom? All the data champions really are either in the United States or in China. And what do you see as an important part of learning from the mistakes of previous policies about how we should be using competition policy on those international data champions to help provide that sort of competence and capability that we may need?
I was a member of Jason Furman's panel that reported on digital competition, so you won't be surprised to hear that I'm very much in sympathy with the idea that we need to develop an effective digital competition policy, and the CMA is working on that at the moment. I think that's very important. But just to emphasise the point about if we can create a national data resource, we know that we have the AI skills, then this is a real opportunity for Britain to have a thriving industry in the years ahead.
Thank you, Chair.
Sorry, can I add something on the steel part of the question?
If it's very brief because of time, but yes.
Yes, the way to at least how to think about a challenge-oriented approach, how it fits then with support to particular sectors like steel, is that the challenge then creates conditionality. So in Germany, for example, they had the Energiewende challenge that then determined how the public sector interacted with the steel industry. There was conditions attached to receiving any sort of public subsidy or bailout. You'll recall that just over a year and a half ago, steel was asking for a bailout in this country, and the conditions in Germany was that steel had to lower its material content, and it did that through repurpose, reuse, and recycle. So it actually had to innovate, it had to invest in order to receive a public subsidy. And I think that is something that has actually been quite weak in terms of the public-private relationship in the UK in terms of conditionalities in exchange for really ambitious and important public support. And we see that, by the way, today with COVID, the lack of conditionalities in the UK compared to France, Denmark, and Austria.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's an important point, and no doubt one that we will continue to consider as the government announces its next stage of fiscal support. Over now to Charlotte Nichols, please. Charlotte.
Thank you, Chair. My question is to Professor Coyle. You were appointed as a member of the Industrial Strategy Council in November 2018. What impact did the Council have, and why did you stand down from it?
I think one of the important things that the Council started early was to set up the monitoring subject to the data limitations that I was just referring to. And, it has recently, I think, found its voice, and its report recently, criticised aspects of the implementation of the industrial strategy. And I think in particular, monitoring which policies are actually put into effect and which not. We're very bad at policy evaluation and monitoring in the UK. I stepped down for family reasons. It was nothing, there's nothing nefarious about it. But what I had hoped the Industrial Council would have been more suited to my skills and preferences, and that's an independent evaluation body, whereas it's actually more of a representative body. Of course, it's really important to hear all the different voices from industry and around the country. But I would like it to have been something more like the OBR, an independent expert body, something like the CPB in the Netherlands or the Australian Productivity Commission, where that independent evaluation of policy implementation and retrospective evaluation can go on.
Thank you.
Diane, just a quick question from me. The Industrial Strategy Council, did it have proper links with ministers and civil servants who were responsible for actually delivering industrial strategy policy in government, or was it purely this kind of body of external advisors overseeing what government was doing?
Very close links with officials in BEIS and with the ministers concerned also. So I don't think that was the issue. I think it's the what's the expectation of that kind of body that seems to me to be the missing element. And as I said, my preference would have been for something like the OBR.
My concern is I think there were over 200 policies in the industrial strategy across departments across government. Did you have confidence that people were empowered in each department to prioritise the delivery of industrial strategy policies?
Within each department, as far as I can tell, the missing bit is actually the joining up across departments and a single point of responsibility for delivery across the whole of Whitehall. So it's less than the sum of its parts, I think.
Okay, thank you. Alan Brown, please.
Thanks, Karen. There's been obvious short-term sudden impact to the UK economy because of COVID. Is there any way you can assess the potential medium and long-term impact? Maybe start with yourself, Mariana.
Sure. I mean, one of the questions is what impact does it have on already some of the challenges? Is it gonna worsen it even further? And I think in the same way that both Diana and I were talking about in the beginning in terms of the lagging business investment, especially in long-run drivers of productivity growth, that tends to happen when your expectations of the future are positive, when you have strong expectations of what future growth and market possibilities are. So that would be kind of the negative side, but I agree that, let's focus on the positive. So by steering policies towards really using, for example, the full power of government through the grants, loans, redesigning procurement to be designed to help solve some of the big problems that COVID has thrown our way, both health related, also the digital divide, but also retaining that kind of green growth, Green Deal strategy, both at the national level and the regional, that can then help catalyze business investment. In other words, if government is able through its policies to create more certainty, but also making those kind of higher risk long-term investments, which then crowd in the business sector, that can help balance out that fall in investment. But of course, also the inequality issue that I raised, we know that inequality in some ways has been both a cause in terms of the gravity of the crisis and an effect of the crisis in terms of who it is affecting the most. And given that inequality was already an issue, that is a huge problem. And so we should be putting as much attention as possible to policies that will redistribute income, but also increase the capabilities and capacity of individuals who are most vulnerable in being able to prosper. And that includes, again, education. So I'm very worried about the fact that schools will have been closed almost 6 months. What we're actually doing to strengthen the ability of the public education system, not just through private tutoring, to help the most vulnerable children. I think that's a huge question for the government.
Okay, Ken, before I come to Dan, can I just ask Mariana, obviously you've spoke about regional and I would argue nation differences in growth and inequalities. Now this week in Scotland there's a publication of the Higgins Economic Report. One of the asks there is additional borrowing powers for the Scottish Government so they can actually invest in what longer term industrial strategy and obviously infrastructure. Is that something that you would agree would actually help in terms of the Scottish economy?
Yeah, I mean, I think all localities also, even without looking at Scotland, all, local even councils say across the UK are having to, invest massively. And unfortunately, the idea that they're going to have to pay that money back is really a hindrance. And so ideally giving as much power to local and regional bodies to really make the kind of, investment of whatever it takes to solve both the citizen level problems, but also to foster that long-term growth. In Scotland, I think one of the issues has been that Scotland has had a strategy. Nicola Sturgeon has had a strategy. I'm on her panel of economic advisors around long-term innovation-driven growth, and has actually then set up new entities like the Scottish National Investment Bank. But if the funding for a bank like that is, being kind of withheld, or if the money that is not spent has to go back to the Treasury, that is exactly what kind of prevents that long-termism. So I think focusing as much as we can on structures that really incentivize and enable long-term growth and long-term investments, and giving that, you can call it autonomy, but also agreements that, for example, the funding that the bank does receive can be held for the next year and not given back if it's not spent. It's those kind of details actually that matter as much.
Yeah, so it's about being able to do long-term planning rather than year-on-year.
Yeah, it's impossible to do year-on-year planning for the kind of drivers that we've been talking about, both to solve inequality, but especially to foster innovation-led, investment-led growth.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Do you want to add anything about the potential medium and long-term impact? Obviously, the challenges as well.
I'd completely echo this concern about what we economists would call scarring on people's labour market prospects, especially young people who've missed out on part of their education or their exams have been disrupted. If you go into the labour market at an early stage in your career in a recession, that can be a lifetime penalty. So I think avoiding the mistakes of previous downturns in the 80s and 90s through the labour market effects is really important. The one thing that I would add is that the evidence from history is that actually major crises do sometimes cause people to reevaluate. There's a kind of reset. And I think we see that in some of the conversations that are going on in public now about the future of the economy, low pay for key workers, job conditions for people working freelance or in the gig economy, the impact of the economy on the environment, and particularly the food system, this concern about resilience. Have we focused too much on efficiency? How does resilience fit with the need to improve productivity? And even more broadly, how do we assess future progress? And is it time to go beyond GDP growth? Actually, I thought that the really excellent report on the Scottish economy this week highlighted that last concern, and that got that conversation really, really well.
Okay, can I just ask also, obviously the furlough scheme has been very welcomed by industries across the UK, but now as we look forward to getting back to normality, there's an argument that some sectors actually could require the furlough scheme to operate longer, maybe a sectorial approach rather than the one size fits all. Do any of you have any views on that? And also possibly the argument that more loans need to be transferred to grants, because otherwise it's just debts that businesses are struggling to repay. Maybe start with you, Mariana. Sorry, Diana, I'll let you in first, then Mariana.
I'll be very brief. It's a great question. I think there are some sectors where we can see that their long-term contribution to the economy through export earnings is going to be important, and we want to sustain them over the short term. So the parts of the creative sector, for example, might fall into that category, and one has to make judgments then about which parts of the economy do have those long-term prospects and ought to be sustained over the short term.
Yeah, I would echo that. All these measures are very important, and especially they need to be around for as long as they're needed. However, coming back to my previous point about conditionalities, furloughs are also benefits that businesses receive by retaining workers, but having the government pay for the salaries in the meantime. And so having more conditions attached to what the actual investments will be by the businesses once the workers are back, also to improve, again, worker training, to retain workers, to invest in the relevant sectors in reducing carbon emissions, to not using, tax savings. There's all sorts of different conditions that are currently being explored in different countries, actually. Even the Financial Times, not a socialist paper, has been advocating for, conditionalities tied to this kind of government support, which is absolutely essential. And also your point about debt is very key, precisely because private debt to disposable income is so high, making sure that we're not increasing private debt in the process. And so in some cases, also in terms of citizens, making sure that instead of just delaying mortgage payments, in some cases having debt relief. And that would obviously have to be chosen case by case. But increasing private debt right now is definitely not the thing to do, given the weakness of the economy pre-COVID in terms of the financialized nature.
We had the principle before in agriculture, public funds for public good, and I think it's a good principle.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Alan. Moving on now to Mark Pawsey, please. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Chairman. Alan Brown has just referred to the job retention scheme, and that's just one of a whole range of measures that the government introduced very quickly, and a level of intervention that, frankly, is unprecedented and we haven't seen before. I'm just wondering if you could each give me your views on how that intervention has changed attitude towards the principle of intervention. It seems to me that business does want to be left to get on with things and would want a hands-off approach wherever possible as far as government's concerned, but that may be just for the good times, and at bad times, such as those that we're experiencing now, business looks to government for support. So how do you think it's changed the argument and discussion, particularly amongst business people themselves, the attitude from government, and perhaps what do you think the view is amongst the general public to the government intervening? So, Marianne, perhaps you might start.
Sure. I mean, I think what it's done is made those people who didn't realize how important government is and can be, just how essential it is. But the real question is, can we also frame the role of government then differently? Can we learn from this crisis that you can't just wait for government to come in during, a mega epidemic and just kind of patch things up? We really need that kind of government support, government investment as a more continual feature of the economy. And I think it's useful to think of it in a different framing from the more mainstream one, which is you only come in to fix a market failure. Market failures are key. Of course, they're important. We don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I think what we're seeing today is a much more active kind of co-creation, co-shaping of markets between the state and the private sector. But then that begs the question, what does that mean for how we regulate? What does it mean for how public and private interrelate precisely in terms of those conditionalities that I was talking about before? Because otherwise what you were insinuating, which I completely agree with, we end up having a kind of socialization of risks and privatization of rewards mentality. And you also see that with, again, the bailouts when things go bad, government comes in to bail out a company. When things go well, oh, that must be the entrepreneurial, innovative success of the managers driving the business. And of course, that is absolutely true. Managerial competence matters. Private sector investment absolutely matters. But the role that the public sector has both played historically, but also and especially in crisis times, should, over time allow us to really think about wealth creation itself, value creation as a collective endeavor. But that then does require government to be investing in its own capabilities to create that value. So that point I was mentioning in the beginning, the over-reliance in the UK of outsourcing to companies like Serco, G4S, but even the big four consulting companies like Deloitte doing the testing, I think that's sort of a symptom of that lack of continual kind of government investment and overly relying on private sector roles in, even doing things like security in the Olympics, and then it doesn't work. So the military has to come in to cover that failure. So having a more proactive, co-shaping, co-creation view of government and private sector investment really requires also rethinking those relationships and the capacity building that's required.
Okay, and when government has intervened in the last few months, it's done so on an indiscriminate basis. I mean, there are gaps and there are some sectors that have missed out, but it's gone to, but there have been no conditions attached. Now, is it your view that the support packages that have been put in place over the last few months should have had conditions attached to them, or have they been at the right level?
Well, as I was mentioning, what's interesting is the global picture where there have been conditions attached, for example, to the airlines in both Austria and France, whereas the EasyJet package here didn't have any conditions attached. And I do think government needs to use its kind of negotiating power, its leverage to really get conditions, but not just as a stick. It's not about punishing companies that aren't doing something. It's really about fostering what one could call stakeholder capitalism. So if we say we're all in it together, what does that actually mean? So when government is helping the airlines or the automobile sector, what do we expect back from that sector in order to achieve the kind of growth we want? And if the kind of growth we want is inclusive and sustainable, that requires certain types of investments. And it doesn't mean that, the airlines today have to reduce their carbon emissions, but they should, in getting a bailout package, commit to, over the next 2, 3, 4 years, reducing their carbon emissions. And if they're not doing that, to be honest, I'm not really sure why they should be getting a bailout, because it's really about, again, fostering that inclusion, sustainability, but also co-creating value in the ways that I was talking about. And if it's just going to be a handout subsidy guarantees kind of approach, that's really going to be a race to the bottom in the end. And that is also why we have been having, less investment in the UK, because there haven't been conditions attached to investment.
And Diane Coyle, how do you think that attitudes have been changed by government's intervention in business and industry over the last few months?
Well, the demonstration of the scale of government intervention and the extent of its power over the economy actually has been quite stark. I do think it's changing attitudes somewhat, and this is reinforcing a sort of shift that had already started occurring. In the UK, we've had this rather extreme version of the philosophy that it's governments versus markets. Even the United States which has had an industrial policy since the days of Alexander Hamilton, has never stopped, never took it to that kind of extreme. And so one of the things that might come out of the current situation is a more nuanced understanding of how government and business can work together. I do entirely agree about conditionality. If the government is putting in so much money into companies, it has every right and responsibility to incentivize them to take the business in directions that serve societal aims like decarbonisation, with some caution about the inability to invest at a time when they have such downturns in their business and their profits. The one condition that a number of countries attached, which I'm sure we ought to have done, is limits on boardroom pay for the duration that government support's being received.
Okay, and you also spoke in response to an earlier question about policies that are supporting businesses that are not viable in the long term. Is there a danger that in the approach the government have taken with indiscriminate grants, subsidies, job retention scheme, that we've actually supported businesses that might otherwise have failed and will fail at the end of these measures?
In the context of the crisis, I think it was absolutely right to be indiscriminate. It was important to provide that support to the economy as a whole. In time, the moment will come when the government has to accept that some businesses are going to fail. And those are always judgment calls. So there'll be some mistakes made, and I will have every sympathy for people trying to make these difficult judgments. The criteria need to be about long-term viability, but also transition, and particularly in certain locations, do you not want job losses to fall all at the same time in certain places? And also that there may be public goods that it's absolutely appropriate to subsidise. I gave the example earlier of the creative sector. I'm absolutely fine about paying people to work in that sector for quite a long time ahead. And there are broader benefits and long-term benefits that would come from that. But these are judgment calls, and there will be companies that go under and jobs that get lost.
Can
And
I just
you
add
happy?
something to, sorry.
Can I just come back on that?
Sure.
Are you happy that the way that support is packaged doesn't simply prop up failing businesses? Are you happy that, or should the support be changed in order to pick out those that are going to succeed and leave those to fail that would otherwise fail?
Well, so far that hasn't been an issue because it's been so important to prevent an even steeper collapse in economic activity. I think those decisions come now, and they're not easy. I'm not a believer in the government's ability to make these judgments very well, so there will be mistakes made in this respect.
So is the market better able to make those decisions? Is that what you're saying? Can the market do it better than government?
Well, in the long term, the market can always do better than government, but we're talking about a transition out of a particularly acute crisis where the government has, of necessity, become very involved. And those are the judgments that people in the Treasury and BEIS are going to have to be making over the next 6 to 12 months.
Okay, sorry, Mariana, you wanted to come in?
Please. Yeah, sorry, because I'm very passionate about this. I wrote a whole book about this called The Entrepreneurial State. And in other words, can the state be entrepreneurial? Can it actually make investments, or should these kinds of strategic investments just be made by the market? And I think it always depends. And there's ways to do it really badly, and there's ways to do it better. And so definitely that example I gave of EasyJet, which just received 600 million in liquidity from the Bank of England, despite having paid 174 million in dividends just a month earlier, that's basically that kind of lack of conditionality. But this bigger question of, do you then invest in companies just if they're succeeding, or should you be bailing out companies that don't look like they're going to have good prospects? I think Diane is absolutely right. Even in good times, you don't know. There's always going to be uncertainty. But the bigger question is, should government just be coming in to help when the businesses are struggling? And I think the answer should be no. Precisely the point of, if you have a challenge-oriented, kind of mission-oriented policy, what you should be picking are not specific companies, but a trajectory. So if you want to have a green growth trajectory, there might be high-risk, capital-intensive investments that actually require government to come in early, precisely to crowd in the private sector later. But downstream, those few companies that are actually willing to engage with something like a green transition strategy often need long-term patient finance. And in a country where there's lots of impatient finance, not enough of patient finance, that will often come from government. And the real question is to make sure it's structured as a portfolio, not just picking one company, putting all your eggs in one basket. And the lesson really in the US, which I think is fascinating during the Obama administration, was that it's exactly what they did. They gave companies like Tesla 500 million guaranteed loan. Same amount of money went to Solyndra. Solyndra went bankrupt. Taxpayer had to bail them out. Tesla was a success. And what Obama said to Elon Musk at the time, he said, if you don't pay back the loan, we get 3 million shares in your company. When they did pay back the loan in 2013, the price per share went from 9 to 90 between 2009 and 2013. That difference in price multiplied by 3 million would have more than paid back the Solyndra loss and the next round of investment. So the issue of how do you socialize both risks and rewards can also be answered by sometimes you might take out some equity stakes, not permanently. It's not about nationalization. It's not about ownership, but governing that process as an investor first resort, not just a lender of last resort through a portfolio approach, which might mean also temporary equity stakes so that citizens are also benefiting from the upside, not just covering the downside.
Okay, thank you. This is a really interesting part of our inquiry, but I really ought to go back to the chair.
To Alexander Stafford, please.
Thank you.
Oh, you're on mute, Alex.
Sorry, thank you, Chair. So, yeah, and I'm sure you both know, on the 8th of June, the Business Secretary, Alex Sharma, launched 5 new business-focused groups. So, Future of Industry, Green Recovery, Backing Business, I'm sure you know them, to unleash Britain's growth potential. I guess the question to you is, first of all, do these groups address the key issues? Are they the right groups, basically? Which ones are missing? I can read you all of them if you need. And also, what are the inherent contradictions in them? Because obviously, one is looking at the future of industry and basically exports and other exports, but there's also looking at the green recovery. So my question is there a conflict between these groups, or can they work harmoniously?
Who should go first?
Shall I have a go?
Thank you.
So the groups, they're very wide-ranging, and I wouldn't pick out any big things that are missing. I think my question about them actually goes to the second part of your question, which is about how do you think about the overlaps between them and the trade-offs that are going to be made. So I hope there's some way that the groups will work together and BEIS and the government can think about the ways these different policies need to interact with each other. There are always trade-offs in economic decisions, and that's where political judgment comes into it. So there will be conflicts between short-term objectives, saving jobs in the short term in particular types of businesses versus long-term objectives of decarbonisation. And that's why it's a particularly difficult moment, because the pandemic means the collapse in the economy short-term makes those short-term goals really important. I guess I think the challenge is to be quite clear about which bits are transitional, which bits are about transitional assistance and transitional policies, and what are the longer term objectives. When we get to a point where businesses can afford to invest again, we clearly want all that investment to be directed towards the kind of broad societal aims such as long-term care or decarbonisation. But there's no easy way to avoid trade-offs, I think, and that makes the joining up between the different groups absolutely essential.
I had the privilege to attend the Future of Industry one on June 12th, and it was very positive. I think my reflections would be that they're great groups. I mean, it's a good list, but it doesn't really push much further than what was already being discussed in the 2017 and 2018 industrial strategy. So really making sure it builds on that and doesn't just start up a whole new conversation precisely due to the problem that we were talking about before. I mean, I've lived in this country for 20 years, and just the department, now called BEIS, has I think changed its name 3 different times. The TSB has changed its name 2 or 3 different times. Now it's Innovate UK. So really getting more stability and a deeper discussion about these common themes is critical. But one big gap, I think, at least in my experience in looking at the roundtables, is it's had a very weak or non-existent participation of trade unions. And so really, again, bringing that stakeholder governance kind of lens to these discussions is critical. And in that sense, we should remember that in September, was it end of August, the Business Roundtable, so the 180 CEOs, global CEOs, of the 180 kind of most successful companies have actually called for a real rethink in corporate governance, and in so doing have talked about this issue of stakeholder governance. And I think the UK really needs to take that on board in the process through which these roundtables are discussed, so it's not skewed just towards business.
Just thank you. On the trade union point, maybe if you could slightly elaborate a bit more about the value you think is missing because they're not fully involved. What value would be that how would they add value in your view?
Well, you use the right word, value. So if one has a view that value is co-created, not just by business and then simply facilitated or de-risked by the public sector, then you need, business, government, trade unions, meaning a voice of labor, which in some countries, by the way, isn't necessarily through trade unions. It could be in Spain, for example, there's a very active cooperative movement in the Basque region. We've been looking at precisely the cooperative movement to inspire new thinking around stakeholder governance. So it's really not just about only trade unions, but you need to bring all the different stakeholders to the table. And it really isn't, I think, productive to just be bringing, business and have a conversation with government kind of behind closed doors. The more this can be a really active debate and discussion between, again, government, business, different voices of labor, but also, I should say, movements. I mean, one thing that we should realize that without social movements, we wouldn't have many great things from, the 8-hour workday, the weekend, but also, birth control, the AIDS drugs. There was actually people who fought for change, and the green movement itself, or Fridays for the Future amongst the student movement. I think that's been a really refreshing, kind of energizing thing in the last years, and bringing those voices to the table as well in terms of what kind of economy do we want to build. So surely, at least in the green recovery part of that discussion, but definitely labor has to be at the table ex ante, not just ex post, defending itself around kind of just transition.
And just I'm cognizant of time, just moving a bit more into the growth. And what are, for both of you, what are the key challenges for the government over the next few years about delivering growth? And what policy levers can the government use to deliver on growth, in your views? Mariana, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, just coming back to the challenges I mentioned in the beginning, I mean, this problem of having lots of impatient finance, we definitely need more patient, long-term committed finance. And I think there was movement on that in terms of setting up a business bank, but unfortunately it still has to go through the private banking sector and can't actually lend on its own. So setting up a proper set of different types of public finance funds, I think that is important. Moving away from a consumption-led towards an investment-led, innovation-driven growth dynamic is central, precisely because that's not how we've been growing. Again, it's been mainly private debt-fueled consumption. So moving that also means, why is it that there's so much private debt if people, to retain their existing living standards, have to take out debt because real wages haven't been growing? That itself becomes part of that problem. So not just issues around debt relief that I was talking about before, but making sure that we are, again, creating conditionalities that make sure that businesses themselves are investing in long-run drivers of what actually increases people's skills and also their long-term wage potential. But this kind of, focus also on structures and institutions in terms of the system of innovation. I think there's a really nice dynamic debate in the UK right now around, for example, the ARPA model, which to me is really just one of the questions, which is what are the kind of gaps right now in terms of really providing institutional support across the whole innovation chain to those companies that are willing to invest, are willing to innovate towards some of the most pressing challenges of our time, like the green transition, and really helping those companies do that and redesigning tools like procurement, grants, and loans to foster that bottom-up experimentation towards solving the problems of our time, I think requires a different mindset of how to do procurement. Again, not just low cost, but really being able to funnel that bottom-up experimentation.
So I think I agree that the big gap is the government financial vehicles. The British Business Bank doesn't have the right structure. We used to have 3i, which is a terrific vehicle for equity stakes. The institutional issues, I think, go broader. I mean, the government has lots of policy levers already, but they're not well coordinated, and they need to be coordinated to address the systemic long-term problems that we have. And I think the institutional issues go well beyond the innovation system. We have very complex institutional arrangements, governance arrangements, and accountability. Decision-making in the UK is certainly over-centralised. The centre can't possibly have all the information that's needed for good decision-making and good policy in all kinds of areas, health, education and training and so on. I think the pandemic has showed there's just been too little liaison between the centre and local governments. And but the trouble is the last thing we need is another big rearrangement of the furniture, because we've already had too much of that kind of instability. I think it needs a very open discussion between the centre and local leaders about what they know and what's needed. And within the centre, how do policies get joined up across departments? People have been saying this for a long time. It's absolutely true, but the costs it impose on the economy are just getting bigger and bigger.
Great. Thank you very much, Anil. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Going now to Nusrat Ghani.
Thank you, Chairman. The government has announced that it will be providing bailouts as a last resort and taking stakes in strategically important companies. But we've heard this morning from the two witnesses that in the post-COVID world, we need to assess what is strategic and what do we want our economy to look like. So can I please turn to Diane first and say, who gets to decide what is strategic, and is it too early during COVID to make that decision right now?
As we were all discussing earlier, we're not out of the crisis yet. So I don't think these decisions need to be made in the next few weeks. But over the next month, the government clearly needs to start thinking about it. And the criteria will be partly about the kinds of long-term success stories that we know we have in the economy. So that might be creative, it might be AI, it might be pharmaceuticals. We know that they are drivers of exports and investment over the long term, or can be. We've got the technologies that we think we're particularly good at in the UK, like AI. So that's one kind of criterion. Another kind of criterion is thinking about aspects of public good that might not be reflected in the market. And so particular places, are there areas of industry that are tied to particular places, and we need to think about the supply chains and the knock-on consequences for those. So that would be another kind of criterion. And then there's a third, which has been coming to the fore in the economics discussion more recently, and that's about the kinds of know-how that it's important to have in the economy. One of the consequences of outsourcing a lot of manufacturing activity during the 1980s and 1990s has been a loss of important engineering know-how in certain supply chains. I think a really urgent task for the government is to get a really good handle on what supply chains are in the economy and where they are and what kinds of know-how they have. And this is hard because the data doesn't exist in any easy form, but it's an important kind of research and policy question. So thinking about long-term skills, thinking about long-term investment and export prospects, thinking about aspects of public good, including geographic concentration, would be my first step at answering that question.
Mariana?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an excellent question, and we partly covered some of the issues before. So the example I gave, when the German government helped its local steel industry, there were strong conditions attached to decarbonization, and that could be used as a model today. So instead of asking, should we or should we not, help Tata Steel right now, which of course is being done, the question is how. How do you again structure that so actually it helps us build a better economy? So the 500 million, which is, I think, what they're about to get from the government, could actually be linked to a decarbonization strategy, which again would link to the industrial strategy. I mean, that's why all these policies should be linked up. If you have an industrial strategy around 4 goals, from the future of mobility to healthy aging, clean growth, AI, including how AI can help us modernize the welfare state, those become signals and visions for then how you structure a bailout. So less problematic of which companies do bail out. I think right now, lots of different companies require help, so we don't have to be too picky, but how you structure that bailout can then help us make sure, A, that these companies are investing, they're not extracting just through dividends and share buybacks or using tax havens, but reinvesting back into the economy, which will be good, but also investing in that direction that, in theory, we're interested in, given that there is an industrial strategy that does talk about a more inclusive and sustainable type of growth. And all we have to do is look globally. I mean, one of the most successful public, venture capital funds is, in fact, state-funded. It's the CIA's In-Q-Tel, or in Israel, they've been very successful with schemes like the YOSMA Public Venture Capital Fund, which then does retain royalties in their investments. So whether it's through royalties or equity, there are also ways to structure these funds. So even if things go wrong, some of these investments will fail, at least you're getting some of the upside from the successes. Again, this isn't about nationalization, but about just being a smart investor across a broad portfolio, not putting all your eggs in one basket.
Thank you, Mariana. It was interesting you mentioned steel. Are there any sectors or businesses that you think would be controversial not to support, but the government shouldn't, because the global economy has changed and these companies will eventually fail? Diane?
Steel is the hard case. I think you've put your finger on it, and it's not clear, given global oversupply, that the UK and that plant is a viable plant in the long term. So the choice is, do you decide that you use it as a vehicle for driving decarbonisation and creating a kind of niche or distinctive British sector, or do you decide that what's needed here is a transitional kind of assistance?
Mariana?
Yeah, I agree. And that's, by the way, why you also need the trade unions at the table, because any sort of transition like that also has to be just in terms of making sure that the workers who are in a sector that might be judged by the government with its advisors to really be scaled down, at least over time, towards a green transition strategy. There's going to be huge employment and labor, other types of labor consequences. So making sure we bring a stakeholder approach, again, to that negotiation. But we should also remember that, sectors aren't static. They can evolve. I've always been fascinated how in Denmark, they don't only have, strong companies like Vestas in renewable energy, but also lots of different services. So they're actually now the number one providers of high-tech green services to China's green strategy, and China's spending 1.7 trillion in its green transition. So a little country like Denmark is servicing a large country's green transition strategy. So also bringing in that service element and thinking about when we are, thinking what are the sectors of the future, always kind of seeing it through both manufacturing and services, and thinking about how the skills currently in the steel sector can also be repurposed. And that can only happen if we're investing also in the people, the human capital working currently in steel. And again, that currently is being talked about as a just transition. And I think it'd be good to hear more about that in the government's policy.
I think my concern would be the pressure that was put on by regional representatives, whether that skews what we need to do across the country, and vested interests as well.
But that's why you need a strategy, so you don't give in, sorry to interrupt, so you don't give in and get captured by whether it's a particular sector. Academics capture all the time too. So this isn't a kind of anti-business point, but it's certainly true that certain industries have been able to lobby for particular benefits, and that would include the pharmaceutical industry in the past with policies like the patent box, which I think make very little sense. That didn't happen from science, that happened through lobbying. So making sure that government is always aware of how it's getting lobbied and captured by particular interests, whether they be regional or industrial, is absolutely a capability that any government requires. And when it has a strategy towards a green or inclusive transition, and not or, that can help guide what it does, as opposed to just listening to a couple businesses who ask for.
Thank you. Chairman, is it possible that I can go on to my next themed question?
Please do, yes.
Thank you so much. So, and we're also reading that there may be a stimulus package put out by the Chancellor and the Prime Minister next month. And I was reading up what the IMF chief economist was saying, that the crisis is still unclear how our economies will normalise. So if a stimulus package is put forward next month, Diane, is it just too soon to have any decent long-term effect?
Well, any stimulus package is going to help at the moment because of the severity of the downturn. And it may be that the Chancellor will need to come back with more. We have no idea at the moment how the economy is going to what extent the economy is going to recover, because it depends not just on policy, but on people's attitudes, people's willingness to go out and spend money, people's ability to bring their businesses back, and what kind of demand they'll face. So it's still highly uncertain, and we may need more. I think the key, though, is to direct the spending towards people and skills, the human capital that Mariana was just talking about. But there's a lot of talk about a VAT cut. it isn't evident to me that that will actually help very much if it turns out that people are still a bit unwilling to go out and spend money. Reducing the price of a pint by a little bit of money won't help either. So sustaining people in jobs, sustaining training, that would be where I would want to direct stimulus over the next few months.
Investing in people and training, Diane, doesn't bring enough return quickly. That is going to be a problem because they're going to want to see a change in the next few months. But can I just point out that some of the things that are being written about in the papers is that the Chancellor or the proposals will require shovel-ready projects.
Can I address that?
Speaking to my own leader of my county council, shovel-ready projects are available, but they were prepared under a pre-COVID phase. So do you feel that shovel-ready projects aren't going to be what's required post-COVID?
So I've often used that word to describe what the problem is. It seems that we either think of austerity or investment, and when we think of investment, we talk about shovel-ready projects. And coming back to the point of when you have a strategy and a vision for the kind of growth we want, so investment-driven, innovation-driven towards more inclusive and sustainable type of economy, that should guide the type of shovel-ready projects we do, and the word shovel-ready is then no longer useful. So if we're talking about housing, if we're talking about infrastructure, whether that be around transport or others, that those structures, that type of both social and physical infrastructure should embed the kind of vision we have. So again, the most obvious point, having a greener infrastructure you're not going to get there by calling it shovel ready. But we should remember that, this has been the case actually post-crisis, financial crisis. Interest rates have been so low that it really made a lot of sense to be investing in infrastructure. But again, the type of infrastructure we have is key, but also how we finance it. So having more of that patient long-term finance that can also take up some of the higher risk, higher capital intensive areas, which then crowds in private finance. But also I think one worry, again, coming back to the austerity point, is that even though there's lots of money being put in now, no one's talking about austerity, but unfortunately we're already starting to hear terms like burden sharing coming back, which makes me think that those local authorities that I was talking about before, which are currently been giving cash injections, will soon have to pay that back. And I think that would be a mistake to do it in a very indiscriminate way. We need to be asking ourselves, what have we learned during this crisis about the essential services, this beautiful word, I think, key workers, essential workers, and essential parts of the economy, which unfortunately, even in good times, we were undervaluing and under-resourcing. So let's make sure we actually resource them properly post, both during COVID and post-COVID. So in the next crisis, the next pandemic, there will be one, we're better prepared.
I don't think it matters whether projects are shovel ready or not, because we need the investment long term. So even if they're not, we should be going ahead and doing the work. But there are also lots of types of projects that we need that aren't big infrastructure projects. So for example, restoring lots of natural capital assets, restoring wetlands, tree planting upstream to avert flooding in future. There are loads of investments that the country needs, and we should be cracking on with them.
For that.
And that's exactly what lies behind the job guarantee scheme that's being actually discussed in many countries, which is precisely, and I use the word shovel ready simply to mean it's easy, there's already plans out there, let's think about it. So lots of interesting plans around natural capital, as you were mentioning, but then the how we do it, I think, should be discussed in terms of making sure it fits the strategy. But a job guarantee scheme could actually help, government also employ directly, as opposed to income support, which is also important, but employing directly people in those kinds of jobs for areas which are, again, emerging, that would be, essential, again, for a green transition. There's all sorts of green services that could be serviced initially by jobs that government could fund initially, at least, and use that period to actually invest in the training of people.
We have a few minutes left before we need to call the session to an end, so I'm going to call Paul Howell and then Alan Brown with some supplemental questions. Paul, to you first.
Thanks, Chair. I think Nusrat's covered a part of the question I was going to ask anyway, but in terms of what you've said, and particularly Diane, you've talked about the need to understand the long-term needs in any short-term actions, and whether that be about regional support, whether it be about the supply chain integrity, whatever it is, the two considerations. And as Nusrat said, it's well speculated that the Chancellor's going to put some sort of stimulus into the economy within the next few weeks, which is speculated on everything from skills through to infrastructure investment. Given that you've already said that it's a few months before we need to make some of these decisions as opposed to a few weeks, what do you think you should actually be doing in this sort of stimulus at the moment? What messages, what particular initiatives, where do you think that we're looking at in the short term actions? Going to start with Diane?
I'll start. And so I think we've covered the jobs guarantee. I do completely agree about that. Not only making sure people have enough to live on, but that what they're doing is providing some public good and some future economic good. So that's a really important area. Stimulus through the education sector and making up the really damaging losses that certain kinds of pupils have suffered from not being in school for a long time and being in the kinds of schools or not having the kinds of equipment they need to keep up with their work. And at that age, that can have a very big impact. So I would put a lot of resource into that in the short term. So that's two really important areas of stimulus. And, then there are a very large range of investment needs, and some of them are place focused. One of the challenges, I think, in policies, we were talking earlier about having lots of policy levers, they haven't been used at the right scale. And so thinking about what interventions could you sensibly make in particular places at scale that would help with the long-term ambitions that we all share, and having a good understanding of the capabilities and the skills available in a local area, what other amenities and bits of infrastructure need to go alongside it. So we too often think about these big projects in isolation without thinking about how do you align all the different policies that are needed. So it's not just the investment in a piece of infrastructure, but it's the skills, it's where do people live, it's how do they travel to those places, it's what are the amenities that make those attractive places, what are the schools like, and so on. So getting the whole thing lined up. But I think we've come through a really awful few months in terms of both the pandemic and the economic impact. And this is an opportunity for the government to align people around a vision of what the economy can be and having that long-term focus. So I think it's a pretty awful place to be starting from, but there are some opportunities here.
I would agree. I mean, I think what we've both kept also saying is work also on strengthening and going deeper into the existing policies. So the industrial strategy exists, use that as a major lever through which you actually also create the stimulus. So 3 big areas that I think have to be part of the stimulus in terms of the direction of the stimulus versus just throwing kind of helicopter money into it is green and the Green Deal, both at the city level, the regional level, and the national level. The digital divide question, it's massive and actually, even worse in some ways in the UK than some other European countries due to the, public-private divide of the education system, but also the health services. We have discovered through COVID, luckily globally, that we're only as healthy as our neighbor is. And hopefully that's going to revive what we mean by essential and key workers and actually value them more, invest in them more. We'll remember that there was a huge hemorrhaging actually of talent from the NHS in recent years with the junior doctor strike, but also dissatisfaction amongst nurses. And instead of just worrying about that as a negative, let's bring those people to the discussion. What does it mean to have a strong, resilient, well-funded, innovative health service? And actually using the Beveridge kind of history of the UK, where the UK government in some ways really was an international leader around the welfare state. Let's ask, what kind of welfare state do we need to make our society more resilient and really have an innovation kind of lens to that, which requires both investment, but also redesign on the demand side of areas like procurement policy.
Thanks, Mariana. I could continue this conversation for a huge amount of time. I'm very conscious of time, Chair. And one of my towns is actually designed by Beveridge, so I'm really, very interested in this side of things. But reluctantly, Chair, I'm going to pass back to you.
Thank you, Paul. And again, I promise we'll be revisiting these issues probably time and time again over the coming months. Alan Brown, if you can get your question and answer in within 2 minutes, that would be fantastic. So, Alan, over to you, please.
Okay, thanks. Maybe start with Mariana. You kept talking about the importance of industrial strategy, but if we're looking for a proper green recovery, is it not the case that the only way to the energy white paper needs to come out soon, and therefore there needs to be an energy strategy that fully aligns with the industrial strategy, or the industrial strategy gets revised to accord with the long-term green energy aims? And therefore, rather than a focus on shovel-ready projects, need to look at emerging industries and support them in terms of a just transition.
Absolutely, and that was the point I've been making, and why I really believe that the point is not even to think of energy necessarily as a sector, but energy and the energy transformation as one of the inputs towards actually achieving the strategy around clean growth, which absolutely was center to the industrial strategy, as was the future of mobility part of that. So even just looking at, the kind of missions that we designed in a commission that I co-chaired with David Willits for the government around this mission-oriented approach, the clean growth one included all sorts of different kind of issues around energy, but also recycling, how we change the materials for construction, how we use water, heating. Again, it's an infrastructure problem. So really looking at all the multiple different types of sectors that need to come into an energy transition strategy, and using an industrial strategy lens to that goes beyond just looking at energy as a sector, but really a green transition, which requires lots of different sectors to innovate. And using that then to guide how we think about shovel-ready projects and the types of shovel-ready projects is absolutely what I would advocate.
Very briefly, I'd agree. I'd add transport policy, I'd add natural capital strategy. The challenge is joining all of these up to deliver the outcomes that we want to see.
Thank you for your answers, and thank you for that supplemental question, Alan. This session has been fascinating, and it's shown that there's lots more work to be done, both from our committee and in government, and with partners across business, trade unions and academia. So I look forward to continuing this discussion with you all and with others watching the session today. Thank you to Mariana Mazzucato and Diane Corr for taking the time to be with us today. I bring the session to an end. Order, order.